Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of my podcast, Grit Stories of Resilience. Today is perhaps the first of two podcasts on the same general subject, a little bit differently each time. And I've titled it Stories from the Road with Wade Smith and Joe McGinniss. For those of you who do not know, Wade Smith is a very accomplished North Carolina trial lawyer, primarily criminal, but not always criminal cases. As a defense lawyer, he started out as a prosecutor, but became a well-known defense lawyer. In many, many major cases, Wade and I met many years ago in the spring of 1979. When he was a defense lawyer in Raleigh and I was an assistant United States attorney getting ready to try a murder case by the name of Jeffrey MacDonald. Joe McGinniss, on the other hand, was a book writer so accomplished that at the age of 26 years old, he wrote a book that became a New York Times bestseller, The Selling of the President, 1968. The Selling of the President, 1968. At that time, he was the youngest writer in the United States who had ever put a book on the New York Times best-selling list. Joe went on to an accomplished writing career, wrote 12 books. I met him when he came to North Carolina in 1979, embedded with the Jeffrey MacDonald defense team, living at a fraternity house at NC State during the summer, to write a book. And the only rules that came down from the MacDonald team on this proposed book was that he had to write a book that was consistent with MacDonald's life story. That was it. He came to the trial, attended every day. I think he sat in on lots of the strategy meetings that they had. I don't know that of my own personal knowledge, except I've heard it from Joe telling me that and Wade telling me that, as Wade was a defense lawyer for MacDonald. And Joe and I never spoke during the entire trial. We saw each, I don't know if he saw me, I saw him every day. He went to the crime scene visit with MacDonald and the team. Indeed, there's a photograph of him walking in the street along with MacDonald going into the apartment, the Castle Drive. But we never spoke. We never said hello. I don't think we even acknowledged each other's existence. Still, I knew he was there. Over the years, after the trial, he became a good friend of mine. Wade, of course, also became a good friend of mine. We had lots of times together, lots of ups and downs, some serious, some humorous. So this podcast is a glimpse inside, perhaps not a complete list inside, but as much as I can put together in this oral and visual podcast. It came about as an idea for me because Ann Smith, who is Wade's wife, once was introducing me to another person at her brother-in-law, Roger Smith's funeral service a few months back. And at the reception after the service in the basement of the church, she was introducing me to this lady and said, "This is Jim Blackburn. He and Wade have the most amazing stories." They could go on and on and on. And so I'm going to tell a few of those stories. They're not just stories of our friendship. There are stories that deal with cases and matters that we dealt with in our professional careers. Some I won, some he won. And in the case, I guess, that has the most interest to me personally is when he represented me. And whether that's a win or a loss depends on who you ask. I take it as a win. Joe continued to write books up until his death at the young age, I might add, of 71 years old in March of 2014 from prostate cancer. The last time I saw Joe was in the early fall or late summer of 2012 in Wilmington, North Carolina, when we were both there on a hearing on the Jeffrey MacDonald case as to whether he would get a new trial. Wade was also there. Wade was on the other side. Joe, by this time, had come over to the side of the good angels, I would say, and worked for the government. But that's all a summary. Let me go back in time and share with you all some of the beginnings of this. It was the spring of 1979, and two things had happened that spring which upset me a lot. I knew that I was going to be the prosecutor, the lead prosecutor in the MacDonald case. I had never tried a murder case, never seen one. I had tried a number of federal court cases by that time, none of them hugely significant. The longest one went for about a week. Most of them went several days. In federal court, the prosecutor wins most of the cases he or she tries. That's because there's an investigative grand jury which can put the case in deep six in the grand jury, and you know what you're getting. You know you got your witnesses sworn in statements, and you're going to not go forward with an indictment unless you can win. So we won most of the time. The MacDonald case was a little bit different. Oh, we had grand jury investigation, grand jury testimony, and all that sort of thing. But I've often said in my life that Jeffrey MacDonald was the only person that I ever prosecuted who I think was truly presumed innocent at the beginning of the trial. All defendants are presumed innocent at the beginning of a trial as a matter of law. This time he was presumed innocent not only in law, but also in fact. So I learned first that Wade Smith, who was a well-known and accomplished defense lawyer, was going to be joining the MacDonald defense team. I did not like that. I did not like that. I didn't know Wade. I had never met him, but his reputation transcended the streets of Raleigh. He had just come off, he and Alan Bailey, a lawyer in Charlotte, had just come off a few months before representing a lady who had shot and killed her husband, who was a doctor, a well-known doctor in Raleigh, on a Sunday in their kitchen, shot him several times. She didn't deny that she shot him. She went to trial. And do you know, ladies, within 30 to 45 minutes of the jury going out, they returned a verdict of not guilty against this lady. Not guilty. So if Wade Smith could be part of a defense team where someone shoots somebody else unarmed in the kitchen with a pistol more than one time and become not guilty in a jury trial, I was in for a bumpy ride. I should add that one of the assets that Wade and Alan Bailey had in this case was the fact that this was one of the first spousal abuse cases that had ever been tried, at least in North Carolina, severe physical spouse abuse cases. And they put on a lot of evidence to that effect. Nevertheless, I am anxious about Wade Smith being involved in this case. And then Wade had a paralegal who became a good friend of mine named Nancy Jones. And one day, Nancy calls me on the phone to say, hello, Jim. She wants to introduce herself to me. I didn't know her at all. And somewhere in the conversation, she tells me that Joe McGinniss was going to be joining the defense team also as a book writer, and that he was going to write a book about the case. Well, I didn't like this either. Good gosh. Not only do I have to try this case against one of the best lawyers in the United States, I've got to do it in front of a best-selling New York Times best-selling book author who is going to be writing a book for the other side. It was not a happy time, but I couldn't let that show. I could not let that show. I had to be strong as I could possibly be, but I was nervous and not a little scared. I was afraid that Joe would portray me as a dumb Southern hick lawyer. Those feelings would remain with me until the publication of the book, Fatal Vision. But here we go. The trial begins. It goes on. I'm nervous. I'm anxious. You know, the MacDonald team even did a poll before the trial as to what he should dress, how he should dress, what kind of suits he should wear, what kind of ties he should wear, what kind of car he should drive. It was a Buick LeSabre is what they selected. They wanted to blend into North Carolina, a Southern state, one they held in not high regard, I might add. But yet, that's where we were. Well, as time went on, we won the case. In late August of 1979, that probably threw Joe's book a little bit off kilter. He could no longer write a book about how MacDonald won this case, was unfairly prosecuted or judged because he got a triple life sentence. I guess he could have tried to write that, but he didn't. He had changed his mind by that time, he said. I went to Richmond, Virginia in December of that year for the arguments on appeal to the Fourth Circuit. We always stayed at the same hotel. Most everyone involved with the court up there would stay at the same hotel. It was the John Marshall Hotel, which wasn't particularly splendid, but it was an old hotel. And it's sort of expected that that's where you would stay. And I saw Joe and met him and spoke to him and said hello and introduced ourselves at the check-in desk. And that's the first time I ever spoke to him in my life. Sometime in the spring or late winter of 1980, the following year, I got a letter from Joe, a complimentary letter, telling me that I had tried a good case along with Brian Murtaugh, and he was going to write a book about it. He wanted to know if I might make myself available for interviews with him. Would I talk with him? And in addition, if it turned out that I would I perhaps help him in opening some doors to other people on the prosecution team, such as Brian Murtaugh, my co-counsel, or, good gracious, Freddie Kassab. Freddie would be the gold mine of the interviews he would want to have, because Freddie was the stepfather of the Colette MacDonald and step-grandparents to the children who were killed. I thought about it for a while. I didn't respond right away. I thought about it for a while and finally concluded I wasn't going to write a book then. I'd never written a book. Didn't know how to write a book. And if a book was going to be written, I wanted in. I wanted to participate. And so I said, yes. It wasn't long before Joe and I were meeting by telephone and in person. He came to Raleigh a number of times, met with me. We talked for hours in interviews. And as you might expect, we began to get more friendly to each other. The thaws of the previous summer, thaws of coldness had gone away. I still had that feeling about being a Southern hick. I remember one night, it was a Sunday night, we were talking, and our family, we invited Joe for dinner. Did not know what to make. We had country ham, scrambled eggs, and grits. Joe had never had grits. I was convinced that he would write that he had become forced to eat grits, which he thought were awful. I don't know. He never wrote about the grits. I think he liked them. He ate them. He never asked for another helping, never asked for to have that dinner again, but he at least was a good sport and had grits that night. It must be a Southern thing. The book was getting ready to come out a couple of years later. And I was told by Joe that I would like the book, that it was going to be a book in which he concluded that MacDonald was guilty and that the government had done a good job in trying and prosecuting this case. I was not totally convinced. In the remaining weeks before the publication of the book, his wife, Nancy, would get on the telephone from me from Massachusetts, where they lived, and read to me passages from the book, from the Galley Prince, trying to convince me that all was well and that he was treating me nicely. And I became a little bit more comfortable. But then the book was published. He sent me a copy. He mailed me a copy of it. There's a nice inscription, something along the lines of, without my help, the book might not ever have taken off and been done. I don't know that that's true, but it was nice for him to say. A friend of mine, Jenny Carroll, who was an ace reporter for the Raleigh News and Observer and had covered the trial every single day, was a friend of mine, and she called me and said, Jim, we have got an advanced copy of the book Fatal Vision, and I want to come over to your house tomorrow afternoon. This will be Sunday afternoon, and maybe we can have something to drink. Can you get us something to drink? And we set up out. It's supposed to be a pretty day. You can sit out on your deck and let me read passages to you. So I said, sure. She came. I still remember sitting, just the two of us, sitting out on the deck of my house, our house, with Jenny Carroll reading long passages from the book Fatal Vision. I sat there being mesmerized by what she was saying because it was very complimentary. And then, lo and behold, Joe calls and says, NBC has bought the rights to put together a miniseries on it for 2 nights, a Sunday and Monday, I think. Anyway, Carl Malden was going to play the role of Freddie Kassab. Eve Marie Saint was going to play the role of Mildred Kassab. Some person whom I never heard of was going to play the role of Joe McGinniss, and another person was going to, I never heard of either, was going to play my role. Everybody's real names would be used in the show. Jenny asked if she could come over to the house and watch the series. I wasn't in the movie or in the film until the second night, and watch it with me and look at my reactions and write about it for the paper. I said, sure. I laughed. I said, sure. So she did. And gosh almighty, the actor who plays me, has the worst Southern accent I have ever heard in my life. And I just crumbled when I heard it and said, "This is terrible." She said, "Jim, it gets worse. Wait till you see who's playing Joe McGinniss. It gets worse. Joe get almost as hard as I did, maybe worse." It was so bad that when Freddie and Mildred went to the screening in California and Los Angeles for the show, after they showed, someone asked them what they thought of it. They said, "Well, it was not an enjoyable experience because of this was, of course, the death of our family. But I thought the film itself was well done, except that that was not Jim Blackburn on the screen." The only thing I take from that is that in one scene, Freddie and Mildred are at the hotel in bed together. This is actually Carl Malden and Eve Marie Saint. And they're concerned about my lack of experience in trying the case. Freddie's jumping up and down on me. And Mildred, or Eve Marie Saint, says, "Freddie, you might want to hush up and slow down a bit. It may be that Mr. Blackburn knows what he is doing and knows this case and how to handle this case a lot better than you or I think he does." That was pretty much it. I paraphrase that, but that's pretty much it. I have said for the longest time that Eve Marie Saint, who was a beautiful actress, and she was still very beautiful at the time of this filming of this show, but a beautiful blonde actress in her youth, was sitting in bed with another man and was talking about me. And that was the highlight of the film for me. I remember going to bookstores and seeing the book Fatal Vision on the shelves, picking it up and seeing my name. I remember the book coming out in paperback, which I was excited because I did not know that pictures would be in the paperback. But there it is, my picture, the same page, right next to Jeffrey MacDonald's picture. That's a high, I should tell you, to see your name in print in a book that becomes a best-selling book. All during this time, I'm getting to know Wade Smith. We met in the spring. I don't recall how we first met, whether it was in court or in an office visit or over the telephone or how, but we met and talked and immediately got along really well. But I have to tell you, that's more Wade than me. It is impossible, I think, impossible to dislike Wade, who is so charming. That charming part of Wade, though, can disarm you. It disarmed me. This is a good time to tell you that it disarmed me so much. We got along so well before the trial that on the first day of the trial, when the evidence started, it was on a Thursday. We had selected the jury in 3 days. On Thursday, he gets up to make his opening argument, and it's not a long opening statement. It's about 20, 25 minutes. My golly, he's trying to win the case. I can still remember turning to an assistant U.S. attorney sitting next to me and saying, "I can't believe this. Wade Smith is against us. He's trying to win this case." Well, of course he is. Jim, you idiot. Of course he is. That is a measure of how much I had been disarmed. We used to say to each other all the time in court, "You know, Wade, when this case is over, we're going to get along really well and try cases together and be great friends." He said, "Yes, absolutely." And you know, that had the effect, I don't know whether it was intentional or not, but it had an effect of just taking your guard down just a little bit, not too much, just a little bit. Bernie Siegel, on the other hand, was cantankerous and curmudgeon, tough old guy. I liked Bernie. I got along well with Bernie for the most part. I don't think we ever had any harsh words with each other. But he was not Wade. And he didn't get along with Judge Dupree very well. And we would have these motion hearings and arguments on all sorts of things. It would be very, very stressful. Words would be said, shouts would be made, arguments would be made. Brian, who was there with me, did not like Bernie, and Bernie did not like Brian. And so it was like the Hatfields and the McCoys. Let me just tell you, it was awful. In one particular afternoon, I was so stressed out that Wade said, Jim, why don't you come by my office this afternoon? Let's talk a bit. So I said, okay. So I went by his office. He had a partner, Wade Hargrove. Wade Hargrove was Harrington Smith Hargrove at that time. They both sang and played musical instruments. Wade got his banjo out. I don't remember what it was that Hargrove had, but they had sat in Wade's office, for 15 or 20 minutes and just sang songs. Just sang songs. And we laughed. And by the time I left, 30, 45 minutes later, the tension that I felt earlier that day had gone away. It's remarkable. We got ready to start the case. And I remember one day, the defense wanted us, the government, to provide them with copies of daily transcripts, which we were going to have. And they wanted us to provide copies for them because they were very expensive. And the government had more money than they did. I did not want to give them daily transcripts. And Wade said, well, Jim, if you don't give us the daily transcripts, we may require that you put on witnesses, chain of custody witnesses, for all these vials and test results, and to make sure that it can be properly admitted before going into court. We won't stipulate to it. That's going to take up time. That's going to take up a lot of jury time. It's going to bog you down. You're going to have to get all these witnesses here. And we said, okay. We played hardball back. We even flew in from all over the world, chain of custody witnesses who would be on the stand for only a few minutes. We could do that because they could come on military transport. And the other side, Wade's team and Bernie backed away from that. It was a stressful trial. By 9 o'clock or 9:30, you might be way up and happy. By 10 o'clock or 10:30 at break time, you would be in the pits of hell. It was that way all the time. They wanted us to let them know who was going to be our next witness, so they could prepare their questions and be ready. Well, I didn't want to do that. We had over 100 witnesses subpoenaed. We weren't going to call 100 witnesses. We were going to call probably 35 or 40 at most. And the order in which they were going to be called is very important to either side to know who's coming next. And I resisted, and Brian resisted for the longest time. That Wade was going to cross-examine Freddie Cassava if we ever called him. We didn't ever call him. We weren't intending to call him. And Wade knew that, but he would look over and smile and laugh and say, I would tell him, I said, Wade, you need to be ready because I think Freddie may be up tomorrow. And he said, oh, okay. Knowing full well that that was not going to happen. It brought some humor to the case. Finally, after a week or so, we reneged a little bit and began telling them who we were going to call the next day. We wouldn't go 2 or 3 days in advance, but we would go the next day and let them know who was going to be up. That is sort of the grease by which any jury trial goes a little bit better, when both sides tend to let either side or the opposite side know who the witnesses are that you're going to call next. During one stressful time in the second half of the trial, Wade was going to have a witness that was going to be an expert on fingerprints, evidence, forensic evidence, and it was very technical. It was going to be my job to cross-examine him. And I did not know what in the world I was doing with this witness. I didn't know the science or anything like that. And, and Wade turned to me and he said, "I'll tell you what, Jim, I'm going to make that our witness, I've forgotten the guy's name, available to you this afternoon after court. And you can sit there and tonight or as long as you want, wherever you want, and talk to him and interview him. I don't need to be present. I don't want to be present, but you can do that. And I just want to help you so that this testimony will go better with you on cross-examination. I think your questions will be better. And I think that will make the trial better." Wade was actually interested in making the trial go better. You know, one of the things I learned in this case that I need to pass on to you, or want to pass on to you, that when you go against the best, it makes you better. Even if you don't win, even if you get knocked down, when you go against the best, it makes you try harder, you work harder, you learn more. Basketball teams who play hard games in the month of December. Carolina, for example, playing Kentucky, Duke playing Kentucky, or somebody else for either school. It makes them better in March. It makes them stronger. They get better ratings in the polls. You don't get ratings in the polls if you just beat the Sisters of the Poor. You got to play the tough teams. So it is in jury trials. To win hard cases, you've got to go against hard, tough opponents. That's just the way it is. And you've got to be prepared to do it. It makes you work harder. And one of the great benefits of trying cases against Wade Smith in my career as a lawyer was when I knew that I went against him, I was going against the best. It's just that simple. I didn't want to go against him. I never wanted to try case against him, because I always thought I might lose. And that was just awful thought for myself. Yet, it was the best thing for me. It was the best thing. I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but I want to go back to one earlier part of the trial. We were doing jury selection. And Wade and I were the two people who would meet at Judge Dupree's bench and tell the judge whether we were passing or challenging a potential juror. We did them one at a time. They had a jury expert from Duke, which is one of the first ones to ever have such a jury expert. That wasn't the norm back then. We had IBM printout sheets, and we'd pull them up, and so they would think that we were doing something really cool, but we weren't. We just looked hiding behind them and saying, "What do you think?" "I don't know. What do you think, Brian?" And I would turn to my secretary, "Gail, what do you think?" And that was it. That's how we did it. But at the bench one time, Wade looked at me and smiled. He said, "You know, Jim, it's really interesting. We want the same type of jury. We're trying to be interested in the same type of individual person to be on the jury. Isn't that remarkable? We've got an expert telling us what to do. You must have some great expert stuff also telling you what to do." And I just smiled and laughed and said, "Yes." And then went back and said, "Brian, you're never going to believe this." As it turned out, we were successful in the case. But you know, Wade got cheated out by his own co-counsel of being able to make his closing argument in full, which was scheduled for an hour. He only gave it a 10-minute shot, which came about as a result of our giving him 10 minutes of our time so he could do so. And he got the jury quiet, very quiet during that time. Half the world thinks that if Wade Smith had been able to give his entire closing argument, the result in the case might very well have been different. And if not that, if he'd been in charge of the defense strategy, the case might have turned out differently. The truth is, we will never know, but that's not an implausible thought. He was that good, and had that good a reputation. But you know, one of the things I learned from Wade is how to win with grace and how to lose with grace. He did that. He was a gentleman all the time. One of the most stressful summers I've ever had in my life, and there was never a harsh word between he and our whole side, Ryan, myself, any of our witnesses, the agents, anybody. It was always just one of mutual respect. We were well on our way to becoming friends. I would go on to become a court-appointed United States attorney in the spring of 1980, and leaving the office in October of 1981, Wade and Roger Smith and myself would try one more case, which I've talked about in a previous podcast called Three Chairs in the Courtroom. And it was a PCB, environmental dispute case. And then it was time to leave the office because President Reagan was now president. He was a Republican. I had been appointed by the Democrats. I was United States attorney, and it's the standard thing for the U.S. attorney, not necessarily the assistants, but the U.S. attorney, to change over at the change of a new administration. I still remember in the latter part of the summer of 1981 that Wade called me one day and said, "You know, Jim, I've just been retained on a case, and the fee is $5,000. A criminal case, fee is $5,000. I know you're going to set up your law practice soon in September, October. If you will do this, if you'll leave the office a little earlier than when your successor takes over, maybe a month or so ahead of time, and leave and set up your law firm, I'll get you in as co-counsel in this case, and I'll split the fee with you, $2,500. I'll put $2,500 in a check to you. You can put it in the bank. That's a great start. What do you think?" Well, I was overwhelmed, absolutely overwhelmed. I didn't do it. I didn't do it because I guess I was skittish and afraid of leaving the bosom of the warm government salary and that sort of thing, and wanted to stay on as U.S. attorney as long as possible, which I did till October, first week in October of that year. And by that time, the case was well on its way that Wade was working on. But I will never forget that he invited me to do that. The first day I was in private practice was a Monday. Early that morning, I went to the federal building as United States attorney. There's a big crowd there. They were swearing in Sam Curran, my successor, as United States attorney, and I wanted to be present, or I was expected to be present for that swearing in. which I was. By 10:30, at the very young age of my mid-30s, I was in the past. My career as a prosecutor was over. I had loved being an assistant U.S. attorney. I had loved trying cases in federal court. I had loved being a United States attorney. Though I must tell you that trying cases is much more fun than being in charge of anybody else. At least I felt that way. I didn't have too long to feel sorry for myself because at 12:30 or 1 o'clock, I met Wade at the City Club in Raleigh. He had arranged a lunch for me with about 4 or 5 other criminal defense lawyers in town to introduce me to the criminal defense bar, so to speak, in Raleigh. I knew all of them by name, but I never tried cases with anyone. I don't think of them. I may have done a little bit, but not much. And that was the beginning of our friendship in private practice. You know, it's hard to take out set up a new firm. Rick and I had 2 offices given to us by a greatly reduced rate by Gene Boyce, a lawyer in Raleigh, a great lawyer in Raleigh. We had no secretary yet. We didn't have a typewriter. We did have a secretarial desk. We had no filing cabinets. We didn't have telephones. Rick would pick up the phone every 2 or 3 hours, see if the phone was still working because nobody was calling. And then slowly one day somebody called. And then another day somebody else called. And it began. We lived for a time off referrals and rejects from Tharrington, Smith, and Hargrove that Wade Smith sent my way. If he got involved in a case involving multiple defendants, he would send one of the defendants to me to represent. And that was the beginning of building a private law practice. Years later, we would sit in a restaurant and I would ask Wade what he thought was the most important thing he had learned in the practice of law that he could tell somebody else to do. What was so good that he could tell somebody else to do? What was so important? And he said, it's scripture, Jim. It's scripture. It's in the New Testament. If your opponent or your adversary is thirsty, give him something to drink. If your opponent or adversary is thirsty, give him something to drink. Think how the world would be different if more people practiced that. Well, we weren't adversaries or opponents. We were really sort of on the same side now in the fall of 1981. Yet we were thirsty. And he was giving us, Rick and I, something to drink. You may recall in one of the podcasts I did with Wade, I asked him the question of how he decided to practice law in the way that he did. That is to say, the disarming type fellow, the nice person, being gracious to people, helping folks out. How did he decide to do that? That's not the way all lawyers practice law. He said, yeah, my philosophy, really born of my childhood, growing up near Albemarle, North Carolina, when my grandfather preached to a small church. And I went Wednesday nights and most all day Sunday, including Sunday nights, and listened to him preach, sitting there with Roger and my parents. And it began to take into me. And so my philosophy became that way. My philosophy of practicing law is a New Testament way. That is to say, the spirit of the Sermon on the Mount. Think about that. The spirit of the Sermon on the Mount as your philosophy of practicing law. Or if you're in some other profession other than that, other than the law, using the same philosophy in going forward. Wade and I would practice law together and have some cases together. I want to close this first session, with a story that a number of years ago, Wade was being honored by the North Carolina Bar Association and having a fund named to him that would give money to those who could not afford legal representation. He was invited to be present, and he could ask two people to be speakers. Mel Williams, a preacher and singer, along with Wade in Durham, whom I knew in college, by the way, and myself were the two speakers. And he said, Jim, I want you to tell some stories in about, you don't have it about 5 to 7 minutes, so you'll have to make it quick. But there is one story that I would like for you to tell. I said, which story is that? He said, it's the story of the Jimmy Green case, who was the lieutenant governor. And I've told this story before on a previous podcast, I know, but I will tell it one last time to end this first episode with Stories from the Road with Wade and Joe. The jury has gone out on a Friday. I was relaxing, thinking I would have several hours to wait and see what the jury did. I was hopeful that we might have a shot at winning, but I thought it was going to be close and tense. I didn't know. I had no idea. The foreman was in there with the jury, and one of the bailiffs who had gone in to take them coffee and different things and attend to their needs and whatnot, saw me in the lobby of the third floor of the Wake County Courthouse. He says, Mr. Blackmer, I've been in the jury room, and while I can't tell you what's going on in there, they're laughing. And I looked at him, I said, this is probably not good for me. He says, no, I don't think it is either. A jury made up of people who are in the jury room laughing aren't stressing out about whether they're going to convict somebody. So I said, well, okay, well, thank you very much. Would you be willing to let the jury stay in the room for at least 2 hours before they come back to the jury room, even if they got a verdict? He said, sure. Why not? Why do you want me to do that? Well, because it will be less embarrassing to me if they come back too soon. I'm telling all this, by the way, to the Bar Association, including several members of the Supreme Court, federal judges, and executive director of the State Bar. And as it turns out, I went to find Wade and told him exactly what happened and what the bailiff had said to me. I said, Wade, I don't know what I'm going to do or what I'm going to say to the press. There was a lot of press there, and they were expecting us to each make statements after the case was done. What on earth am I going to say? He said, well, let's go in here and talk about it for a moment. We went into this room just off the courtroom, closed the door, sat down at a table, a couple of chairs, pulled out a pen and a legal pad, started writing some sentences. He didn't say a word to me, just started writing some sentences. He gave the sentences to me. There were two of them. He said, today is a great day in North Carolina because the jury of his peers has determined that the lieutenant governor of North Carolina is not guilty of charges of bribery. Maybe it was one sentence. That's not what I, of course, would like to have said. But I agreed to say, I said, can I use this? Yes, it's yours. Well, victory is 1,000 children and defeats an orphan. And when the jury came back exactly 2 hours later, with the bailiff letting him come back in, they turned him loose on all counts, not guilty on all counts. All the people who sat there on the government side in less than 60 seconds had left the courtroom. And I'm there by myself, getting my files and stuff to walk out of the courtroom. I make my way out the door, down the steps, because the elevators never work very well, to the lobby in the front of the courthouse, through the bright doors into the bright sunshine. It's late in the morning. Not late. It's not even 1 o'clock, maybe 12 or 12:30. A lot of microphones and press. And I pull the sheet of paper out of my shirt and read it and walk away. We didn't have email then, or text, or social media. But in several letters to the editor of the paper, and several letters written to me at my law offices, I got several complimentary remarks from people saying what a classy person I was for being so good about that. And all I had done was simply read what Wade had given to me. That's all I had done. That's it. A friend of mine, Eddie Caldwell, who graduated from Campbell, has been the longtime executive director of the North Carolina Sheriff's Association, once told me that one of the reasons, not the only reason by no means, but one of the reasons that it really influenced him to go to law school was he was so impressed with the way that I handled that at the end of that trial, and what a classy way to do it. And he wanted to be like me. And I laughed. I said, Eddie, I got to tell you something. That wasn't me. That was Wade Smith writing those words. I just simply read the words. He looked at me in absolute amazement. You mean I went to law school in part on something that was not right? I said, that's exactly right. And we laughed. Such was the influence of Wade at that time. I'm going to let that be the end of this first edition or first section or part of Stories from the Road with Wade Smith and Joe McGinniss, and come back next week with a second half where we talk about friendships, stress, being indicted, being represented, thinking about going to prison, thinking about taking a plea, striking a deal, pleading guilty to all charges, possibly another reading of the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament, all sorts of things, both with Joe and Wade, heavily involved. I hope you will be present for that. We will end up also taking a short look at the hearing that took place in 2012 on the rehearing of a motion for a new trial by MacDonald on the basis of allegations against the government. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have any questions, please call me, text me, email me. My cell number is 919-889-7316. I'll be happy to answer them or answer them in the podcast next week. But regardless, this one will post on Monday, June the 3rd, which is, I guess, when you're hearing this. And the next one will be Monday, June the 10th. Thanks and have a great week, everyone.